Dr. Powell is a tenured professor, nationally recognized expert, and thought leader on racial trauma, healing, and health equity. Currently, she also serves as Chief Social Impact and Diversity Officer at Headspace and founder of the Evidence Watch Collective, Inc. She serves as an equity brand strategist for corporations, nonprofits, and academic institutions. She is a routine media contributor and was recently named one of the top 25 essential voices on Black mental health. Dr. Powell serves on and leads several national advisory councils on racial health disparities in boys and men. She is a highly sought speaker who has given invited testimony to the President's Cancer Panel and House Committee on Ways and Means. Her numerous scientific articles have been published in the American Journal of Public Health, Journal of Internal Medicine, Behavioral Medicine, and Child Development. Dr. Powell has notably advanced the national public conversation about racial justice and mental health. Her scientific research has been covered by CNN, Business Insider, The Root, Refinery 29, The Washington Post, The Huffington Post, The GRIO, Ebony Magazine, Vice, Tonic, NPR, Vox, Futurity, Forbes, Christianity Today, and Vibe Magazine. Dr. Powell received her PhD and MS in clinical psychology and MPH from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. In recognition of her public service to boys and men, Dr. Powell received the American Psychological Association's Distinguished Professional Award. She is also a White House Fellow, Ford Foundation Fellow, Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Fellow, Aspen Institute Health Innovator Fellow, and awardee of the prestigious Rockefeller Foundation Academic Writing Residency in Bellagio, Italy. Most recently, she was named one of the 25 essential voices in Black mental health. So without further ado, Dr. Powell, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Welcome, everyone. I am so honored to be in this space with all of you and with colleagues and friends to talk about something that I'm extraordinarily passionate about. Today's conversation will be about, in the vein of what this whole convening is about how we can leverage mindfulness to help advance racial justice and how we can protect our own mental health while we pursue that agenda. First, just a little bit about who I am and where I'm from. As you heard about who I am, but I also work at Headspace Health, and we are a mindfulness-based meditation and clinical services organization that provides supports for millions of people around the globe across the continuum of need. And our mission is to transform mental health care to improve the health and happiness of the world. I'm sure that you recognize that the conversations around racial justice are often invigorating, but also spirit-laden. And so before we enter into today's conversation, I want to read a poem and invite you to join me in this brave space. This poem is by Mickey Scott Bay-Jones, and it goes, "Together we will create a brave space because there is no such thing as a safe space. We exist in the world, we all carry scars, and we have all caused wounds. In this space, we seek to turn down the volume of the outside world. We amplify voices that fight to be heard elsewhere. We call each other to more truth and love. We have the right collectively to start somewhere and to continue to grow. We have the responsibility to examine what we think we know. We will not be perfect. This space will not be perfect, but it will be ours, our brave space together, and we will work on it side by side." And with that reading, I want to invite to the room my colleague and dear friend, 𝐚𝐭𝐜𝐡, mindfulness teacher at Headspace Health, who will first introduce himself and then give you all a taste of Headspace as we enter into a guided meditation together. Thank you, 𝐚𝐭𝐜𝐡.
Absolutely, absolutely, Dr. Powell. And that was a lovely poem. Thank you for that. Thank you for that poem. I just want to say greetings to everyone. Thank you for sharing this space with me today. My name is 𝐚𝐭𝐜𝐡, and I'm one of the mindfulness and meditation teachers at Headspace Health. I'm originally from New York, And I've worn many hats in my day. I'm a former licensed acupuncturist. I had a private practice for about 13 years. I'm also a former licensed psychotherapist where I had a private practice for about 1 year. I'm also a social worker. So I'm very passionate about the social issues and social justice in this country, in this world. And I'm also a mindfulness instructor at UNC Chapel Hill School of Medicine, where right now I work in I'm as an adjunct facilitator. But I'm very passionate. I'm very passionate about mindfulness and meditation and the way it can really change the world. And it's really all about self-awareness. It really comes down to self-awareness. Oftentimes, as we go about our daily lives, our awareness is kind of fragmented. We are often thinking about or stuck in the past, ruminating about the past, or planning for the future. And there's nothing wrong with that, nothing wrong with that at all. But oftentimes we can get lost in that. And so what mindfulness allows us to do is to recognize when we're in that space and bring our attention back to the present moment. Because before you can really plan for the future, or even as you are ruminating about the past, first and foremost, it's here and now. What is going on right here, bringing that awareness to this space right here and right now within yourself. And so this meditation, this brief meditation that we're going to drop into is really all about that, bringing that self-awareness to the present moment, right here and right now. All right, so with that being said, let's drop into some practice. So let's just start with a gentle, deep breath, if it's comfortable for you. In through your nose and out through your mouth. And actually, let's do that one more time, if it's okay with you. In through the nose and out through the mouth. And with that exhalation, just allowing your full presence and energy to gently drop into this space right here and right now. And adopting a comfortable and dignified posture of awareness. So noticing that your feet are flat on the floor, hands resting where they're comfortable, in your lap, on your knees. Noticing your sit bones on the surface beneath you. And sitting comfortably tall, but not too rigid, not too rigid. And if it's comfortable for you, I invite you to close your eyes or maintaining a soft, open gaze, not really focusing on anything in particular. And just bringing your attention now to your breath, to your breathing. You're not forcing anything, so breathing naturally. And just noticing the rhythm, the natural rhythm of your breath. And with your next breath, I invite you to shift your attention to your physical self, and just noticing how you're feeling physically right now in this moment. Noticing any sensations throughout your body. And allowing yourself to notice without any judgment, without any inquiry as to why or how. And also without the need to change or fix anything. So with a very gentle and kind curiosity, just simply checking in with yourself, checking in with your physical self. And with your next breath, gently shifting your attention to your emotional self. Just noticing what emotions are present for you right now. Recognizing that there are usually many emotions that are present, but what is predominant for you in this moment? And again, noticing without judgment, without inquiry, and without the need to change or fix anything. And with your next breath, shifting your attention to your thoughts. And just noticing your thoughts as they're flowing through your mind. Or noticing them without getting attached to any thought in particular. Almost as if they were gentle clouds in the sky. You're just watching them as they gently float by. No judgment, no inquiries necessary, and no need to change or fix anything. And now gently shifting your attention back to your breathing, back to your breath. Allowing your attention to be with each in-breath and each out-breath. And once again, if it's comfortable for you, taking a gentle deep breath in through your nose and out through your mouth. And with that exhalation, if your eyes were closed, gently opening them and taking in your surroundings once again. Maybe adding some gentle movement to your space, maybe some shoulder shrugs, shoulder rolls, neck rolls, whatever's comfortable for you. And what I invite you to do is bring this sense of present moment awareness, self-awareness into your everyday life, because this idea of mindfulness is not just an exercise or technique, but it is a way of being. It is a lifestyle. So again, thank you for sharing this space with me as I gently pass it back over to Dr. Powell.
Thank you so much, 𝐚𝐭𝐜𝐡, for such a beautiful meditation. I don't know about those of you who are in the room, but I really needed that today. And it's an especially useful meditation as we move into a discussion about our breath, our eyes, and our memory. One of the things that I know for sure is that there are a lot of stories in the world that help us to understand in a creative way why mindfulness might be an important tool for us to leverage in our efforts to advance racial justice. One of my favorite is by 𝐕𝐢𝐝𝐻𝐿, an award-winning novelist who tells the story of a Haitian mother who tries mightily to push her traumatic past out of her conscious awareness. But in so doing, she inadvertently passes this trauma on to her daughter, who begins to exhibit all the signs and symptoms of a consciousness buried. And what we learn from 𝐕𝐢𝐝𝐻𝐿's novel, and what we should learn about our current efforts around racial justice, is that in order to move ourselves through this difficulty, we have to deploy our breath, our eyes, and our memory. That transmuting this pain requires conscious awareness and vigilance, because old patterns will only repeat themselves and reinstate themselves because they cannot be historicized. Now more than ever, I think it's really important for us to think about how we bring all of these faculties or facilities to advance racial justice. We're living in a time of an unprecedented global pandemic that has produced mounting uncertainty. We're also living in a time of deepening political division and fragmentation. Coupled with that is our extreme acts of community and school violence that we're all bearing witness to. Rising AAPI violence and hate crimes, persistent harms against American Indians and First Nations. And of course, during the pandemic, while sheltering in place, we all bore virtual witness to an uptick in racialized violence. The deaths of Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and George Floyd called us to the proverbial threshing floor, to ask ourselves the critical questions about what kind of world do we want to live in. But most importantly, these potentially traumatizing events really had the effect of stealing our collective breaths. Even as we've observed this troubling set of incidents, it's been very clear that we are on path for growing mission drift in this area. We all remember the calls to action, the letters, the statements, the commitments that were made by organizations and individuals. However, since the George Floyd protest, many companies, organizations, and individuals have drifted away from the commitments that they stated they would make. 32% made statements in support of racial justice. 22% made external commitments. 22% rather of U.S. companies made commitments, and 18% made commitments to change the culture and climate within their organizations. As you listen to today's conversation, I'd ask you to think about where your organization, where you are in your mission to help advance racial justice. And what is racial justice anyway? When we think about racial justice, we define it in a lot of different ways, and I'm sure you'll come across competing or aligned definitions for it in other places. But for today, I'm talking about racial justice as the systematic, fair treatment of all people of all races, resulting in inequitable or equitable opportunities and outcomes for all, that should say. And I want to be clear that when we're talking about racial justice, we're going beyond things like anti-racism. And we're not just talking about the absence of discrimination or inequities, but the presence of deliberate systems, supports, and approaches. And here's why that's important. We're growing demographically in our nation. And right now, demographers suggest that people of color or emerging majorities will make up over half of the U.S. population in 2050. And as the population becomes more diverse, we have to start to think about the social norms and conditions and the rules of engagement that we have held and that we need to hold to create a more unified democracy. It's also important at this moment, as we think about advancing racial justice and any practices and approaches that we may lay bare in front of it, that we recognize that our identities intersect in unique and overlapping ways to produce even more perverse forms of injustice and discrimination. And so that as we contemplate how we apply mindfulness to solve this wicked problem, we must recognize that people are experiencing multiple layers of injustice along the lines of their racial, class-based, gender, sexual role identities, nationality, language preferences, and even age. So we can't talk about racial justice in a vacuum. It's also important for us to recognize that there are competing forces as we try to move towards racial justice that we have to confront in our practice of mindfulness. And one of the key ones is confronting the zero-sum propositions. And I want to make it clear that there will be times in the conversation today where I may be using rote black-white comparisons. It's not because I don't recognize the myriad complexity in all of the populations that are affected. I'm starting with a place to center the conversation and to ignite a dialogue with you rooted in the area of scholarship that I'm most proficient, but also recognizing that even as I'm asking you to be on this mindful learning journey, that I'm on one myself. And that brings me to the acknowledgement of the often zero-sum proposition that can halt racial justice efforts in our nation. And we need to put this up in front before we even start about talking about approaches. Oftentimes, when we hear discussions about racial justice, and especially if we're not a part of the emerging majority group who are most affected by injustice, we can hear loss and gain. And What Angela Glover Blackwell reminds us of, and I'll remind us of today in this room, is that racial equity, racial justice is not a zero-sum proposition. And that, in fact, when we make investments in improving and advancing racial justice for those who are at the receiving end of most of our harm, we actually raise the humanity, the health, the well-being, the mindfulness of a nation. Everybody wins. Because if we're honest with ourselves, we also all shoulder the economic and other costs associated with not doing the work required to advance racial justice. Data suggests, for example, that we have lost nearly $16 trillion in our GDP because of key preventable racial gaps in discriminatory lending and wages and housing, and discrimination in who has access to higher education and who gets to leverage that capital for upward social mobility. We also know that we're at the same time that we're observing all of this political division, violence, and social fragmentation, that America is facing an unprecedented emerging mental health crisis. And COVID-19 alone produced unprecedented upticks in anxiety, depression, and PTSD and substance use among all U.S. adults. So that alone created a layer of mental health challenge. But if you couple that also with the fact that those types of impacts on mental health disproportionately affect certain members of our population, then you can see how, combined with COVID-19 and longstanding inequities, we see a more pronounced perfect storm of difficulty for people who belong to certain marginalized groups. We also have to acknowledge that there's a long scientific evidence base linking exposure to these conditions to poor mental health outcomes among most individuals, among most adults. And here's why we have to be concerned. Because 1 in 5 working adults will experience a diagnosable mental health illness each year. And half will go untreated because of challenges with quality, with challenges with access to care, and rising costs that make even employer-sponsored benefits more difficult to provide comprehensively if we don't identify a low-cost solution. So I want to just compel us all to remember that the work we're doing today, this brave space, isn't about one or two groups benefiting. It's about all of us, because as Jon Kabat-Zinn reminds us, with 7 billion people on the planet and counting, and the extent of the violence we are capable of with our weapons and our intellects, our well-being as a species is unsustainable unless we wake up and learn to love our differences, celebrating them rather than fearing them, as we come to recognize our commonalities. But to get to the love, we have to go through the fire. So there's a fierce urgency right now for us to remember. As the, incomparable Dr. Harriet Washington, author of Medical Apartheid, reminds us, there is a fierce urgency to remember our domestic harms, however painful and however difficult. We have to remember that we have had a history of an unusual form of slavery in our nations, chattel slavery, which meant that not only were you going to be enslaved, but your children and their children and their children's children would be too. Recognizing that this peculiar arrangement produced a kind of anti-Black racism that still permeates the fabric of our nation is an important part of becoming more mindful about racial justice. We have to also remember that our racial progress and our perception of it might be distorted. Because if you look at this graph, you can see that we've spent many, many more years in American chattel slavery and de facto segregation than we have spent in any other portion. And opening our eyes to that reality helps us to see that progress is not natural or inevitable, that we have to actually exercise the kind of vigilance that mindfulness brings to bear. We have to remember that race is not the problem, that race is actually a mythic but fatal sociological invention, as Dr. Dorothy Roberts reminds us. The categories of race are not natural. They are only useful, and race persists because of its political utility. Biologically, all of us in this room and in rooms around the world are really only one race. And yet, we still have racism, a system of structuring opportunity and assigning value just on the social interpretation of how we all look. We know from Dr. Kamara Jones that this type of system operates at multiple levels, making it more difficult for us to cultivate an increasing and vigilant awareness. Because it happens at institutional levels. We breathe it in. It operates like carbon monoxide, odorless, difficult to detect, but noxious. It operates at a personally mediated level. So those kinds of transactions between individuals that happen to produce and reproduce harm. But we also can internalize those messages in ways that can cloud our awareness and prevent us from displaying the kind of loving kindness and compassion for ourselves or others. But one definition that I find really important for thinking about an embodied practice like mindfulness is the one provided by Ta-Nehisi Coates. Ta-Nehisi reminds us that racism is a visceral experience, that it dislodges brains, blocks airways, rips muscles, extracts organs, cracks bones, and breaks teeth. Keeping this definition top of mind as we explore embodied practices will help us be able to identify how we all metabolize the carbon monoxide that we're breathing in and where we feel it most in body, mind, and spirit. It's also important to remember that racism is also habitus. Habitus, as Bordeaux has laid out, is embodied history that we internalize as second nature. It reflects, as Kasonga laid out, the presence of the past and how people deal, how we each deal with current conditions, and how we anticipate challenges and how we're going to respond to them in the future. It's this kind of habitus that leads to the kind of biases that we're here to break. Because cognitive biases are just habits of the mind that we've learned over time or systematic errors in our thinking processes that can affect our decisions. These often are talked about in the context of racism or racial justice as implicit or unconscious bias. Implicit or unconscious bias really refers to those attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding. They're the single stories that Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie warned us to rail against. These biases also can encompass favorable and unfavorable stereotypes, as we've heard sometimes in the so-called minority myth. We also know that biases can also cause us to have automatic feelings and attitudes about other people for really simple reasons. Our brains are hardwired for simplicity. We categorize and chunk people into groups to improve our capacity to understand them. And there are many parts of our brains that are involved in this process, this automated process. Our frontal cortex, which is the part of our brain that helps us to make meaning and to establish those first impressions. It's where our empathy centers sit. And we're going to talk about empathy in just a minute. Our amygdala, which is associated with those automatic responses, those things that tell us to either fight or flee. And our temporal lobe, which stores some basic information about individuals and social stereotypes. If we understand that most of us are operating in automated ways, then we can accept that there is a possibility to disrupt the flow of that automation. And in fact, when what we learn through mindfulness is to cultivate awareness. And it's through the ongoing cultivation of mindfulness to inhabit the space of awareness itself that we come into a creative relationship with all of the ranges of experiences, even again in the face of difficulty, unwanted, and toxic pain. But we also have to recognize that unconscious or implicit bias is not an excuse for bad behavior. And it doesn't disappear just because you have good intentions or training. We actually have to adopt intentional practices that help to guardrail against it, like mindfulness. Mindfulness, as we all know, is awareness that arises when we pay attention on purpose in the present moment, non-judgmentally. And when we deepen our awareness, we're able to mitigate implicit or unconscious bias, cultivate more empathy and compassion, engage in the courageous and fierce conversations that keep us moving forward, even when things get difficult. And we learn to listen deeply with a third ear and without judgment. And it's only in dismantling colorblind ideology that we can truly, truly pay attention to those in front of us as they are, and not by imagining them in skin that would make them more pleasing or acceptable to us. Some of the kinds of biases that I'm talking about can appear in the form of micro-invalidations. Now, many of us have heard of microaggressions, right? Those brief, subtle, commonplace verbal or behavioral indignities, right? But we often don't talk about micro-invalidations, which are verbal comments or behaviors that exclude, negate, or nullify a person's psychological thoughts or feelings or experiential reality. So when a person of color, a non-binary person, a person who speaks English as a second language tries to convey to you that they feel slighted against, we work, if you're not reproducing a micro-invalidation, to just be there, experience what the person is experiencing, and not try to disrupt it for an explanatory model that fits our way of seeing the world. Micro insults are verbal or behavioral remarks or comments that convey rudeness or insensitivity and directly demean a person's racial heritage or identity. Micro assaults are those more explicit racial derogations that really characterize themselves and present as a verbal or nonverbal attack. It's the step before folks start to do the really harmful, physically harmful things that we see have been bearing witness to in our world today. But a subtler one that I think presents itself often in organizations is the omission or lack of presence of people of color in real and symbolic locales. And that often happens in upper levels of leadership. And so as we talk about advancing racial justice individually, doing the interior work, I want you to be thinking about how doing this interior work also will prepare us to be better leaders in organizations. One thing for sure, even though these biases are often automated, that we have to accept that people on the receiving end of those assaults, invalidations, etc., exclusions, will feel the impact regardless of our intent. So part of becoming more mindful in this work is recognizing that if you hit someone with your car unintentionally, it does not make the impact or bodily harm, legal charges, etc., any less real. But here's another way to think about racism and the efforts that we need to put into place to advance racial justice. I love Ruth King's definition of racism. She says that racism is really just purely and simply a heart disease. How we think and respond is at the core of racial suffering, she says, and racial healing. If we cannot think clearly and respond wisely, we will continue to damage the world's heart. This definition is particularly important as we think about one aspect of mindfulness or lever of mindfulness that can be particularly useful when thinking about how we can advance racial justice, and that's cultivating empathy and compassion. Empathy refers to the action of understanding, being aware of, being sensitive to, and sometimes even vicariously experiencing the feelings, thoughts, and exposures of another person. It's the difference between I'm listening as I versus I know, which holds a wholly different amount of power. And why might we need to deepen empathy and cultivate compassion? For lots of reasons. One blatant example is that we have had significant empathy gaps for groups that are not like our own. One sort of glaring example of an empathy gap that I often use when I'm talking about racism in medicine is this long-standing perception that the descendants of African slaves in our nation are more susceptible to and more tolerable of pain. And you would be surprised to learn, some of you in this room who are not already aware, that this empathy gap still affects the way that we deliver and treat people with physical and mental health problems. It affects our capacity to listen and respond to those who express that they are in distress, and it stalls our capacity to build the kind of structural interventions that could lead us to become more mindful and a more mindful and racially just nation. There are certain things that we can do, though, however, to cultivate compassion and empathy. It isn't just an abstract idea. There are steps that we can take that will help us lean in more non-judgmentally when we hear about harms that are affecting groups who may not be the groups that we normally interact with. Things like focusing on the feeling, listening to listen and not to reply. How many times have you been in a conversation with someone and you know that they're just waiting for the moment for you to stop speaking so that they can interject a comment or an opinion? That is so harmful in the space of racial justice because of the silencing, the deep silencing that has happened among many people that have been harmed by racial injustice. We have to also see the reality of chance and luck. We were all born into social circumstances, classes, families, racial groups, ethnic enclaves that we had no control over. And so when you judge something that someone else is doing or feeling, look at it with your heart instead of your head. Do your own research. Sometimes we're waiting for other folks to bring us along the journey, help us become more aware, when in fact the real miracle is in the work that you do to change your interior life so that you can show up better in the outer world. Challenge your empathic imagination. Hold courageous conversations. Now, most of the times when we think about a courageous conversation, some folks think, erroneously, that the conversation has to be comfortable. But if you're mindful and aware, present, then you can sit with the difficulty that arises naturally when we're discussing things like racial injustice. It's about challenging ourselves to improve through our growth through listening to and acting on feedback and providing feedback that will lead us to improvements individually or structurally in the interest of advancing racial justice. It requires us, however, to reflect, to ask, to connect, and expand. Be prepared to be listening and sharing only the anecdotes that demonstrate some degree of similarity. It's really important that we move away from the kinds of behaviors that we think are promoting mindfulness, but that actually signal a limited capacity to practice deep listening. The kinds of things we want to readily adopt is to accept with no explanation, proof, or judgment the person's experience, perception, or retelling of a story of harm. And I remember consciously being in graduate school at the University of Michigan. Dr. James S. Jackson, God rest his soul, my mentor at the time would say, wisdom, it's no need as a psychologist to try to alter someone's perception because perception is their reality. What you want to do is work with the perception, understand it, get beneath it, lean in, see if you can glean from their point of view what it is they're feeling, thinking, and experiencing. Realizing that it's not about us and that we can accept leadership from people who are from emerging majority groups. And it doesn't demean our power or our privilege in the ways that we might think. It's also about avoiding doing some of the things that we know are harmful to mindfulness and that lift up the need rather for us to take a pause and stand in the truth of the feelings that are arisen in those conversations. When we are using a mindful approach to racial justice, we move away from terminology like "I don't see color." I probably could ask everyone in this virtual room to do a ticker tape of the amount of times, especially if you're a person who's been on the receiving end of this, but even those who haven't, where you've actually heard folks say things like this, and well-meaning, automated, habitus, right? But the reality is that when you don't see color, you don't see the full person. And I had someone say that to me, "Dr. Powell, I just forget you're Black." And I said, don't ever do that because that's part of who I am. And efforts to ignore that part of my humanity can backfire and militate against the trustworthiness that's required to form intimate relationships. With mindfulness as a tool, we can also cultivate the kind of critical consciousness that leads us to assess structures. Because actually, as Kamara Jones mentioned, this system of structuring opportunity isn't natural. We can dismantle it, redistribute power, but only if we're willing to do a root cause analysis. Ground our efforts in our desire and our will, not in the desire to look away, as Martine did in Edwidge Danticott's novel, right? But rather to lean in, to work to develop a deeper and more nuanced capacity to perceive and understand, looking for ways to act in favor of what I think is more important than equity, which is liberation. As Jon Kabat-Zinn reminds us, mindfulness has the potential not only to catalyze our own individual transformation, but also the potential to catalyze transformation at the individual, societal, and organizational levels. And I'm going to talk a little bit now about how do we then translate all of this individual interior work of looking into creating a mindful organization. Dr. Jonathan Metzl coined a term and a definition that I think is particularly useful when leading an organization towards becoming more mindful about race, racial justice, or racism, or any other form of harm that might be affecting its business development, operations, flow, and just the general relationships in culture and climate. He says that structural competency is really the ability to discern and acknowledge how structures are made, how the house is built, how the policies are developed, how the delivery systems are designed and orchestrated. How many times have you, in the course of your experience with your employer or as a leader of an organization or unit or a team, have you peeled back the policies and subjected it to an equity or justice audit? Have you been working as a team, as an organization, to develop the kind of competencies that will allow you to look at the hierarchies in your organization and to ask yourself, where might we lean in more? Where might we cultivate more awareness, competency, and capacity to hold space? What we know for sure, however, is that creating a mindful organization, a racially just organization, is not going to happen if leaders don't lead the charge. We have to do, as I learned during my time in the Obama administration, working with military leaders, is that the command climate is so critical to producing structural and organizational change. We're members of systems, all of us, and organizational leaders are in charge of a system. But to make the system run functionally and mindfully, leaders have to do their own individual work. They have to model the courageous conversations, guard against the mission drift that we talked about, engage and listen deeply to employees or folks that are in your leadership ranks, cultivate your own awareness of the power asymmetries in your organization. We think that certain power hierarchies have to exist in organizations when in fact, hierarchies as we have set them up are not natural either and can be unmade and remade in ways that distribute power more equitably. We can partner with employees, commit ourselves to a continuous quality improvement and learning approach, see cultivating mindfulness and justice as an extension of those same approaches. And more importantly, to get around and over and through this crisis that's erupting on the heels of injustice, we have to design and implement inclusive mental health strategies. So I'm encouraging you as leaders, as individuals in this room, to be lions. Dr. Arthur Evans has reminded us that this issue of emerging mental health challenges for organizations that resist the call to action to be more mindful will affect their bottom line. As he says, we know that Americans have been grappling with racism for a long time, but the ongoing racism that the pandemic has pulled forth, coupled with all of the other fragmentation, has produced a peculiar set of challenges for America's mental healh. It it's not just a threat, as I've said before. This is not a zero-sum proposition where only folks who are at the receiving end of those injustices are affected. We all are going to be affected. And so organizations have to work even harder to increase access to the kinds of psychological supports that will promote mindfulness, but also the uptake of even more enhanced mental health services if they're necessary. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about how you can build the kind of strategy in your organization that will move you towards more mindfulness and a more racially just organization. First of all, you have to understand your population's needs. What gets measured gets done. Oftentimes, we don't even disaggregate our data when we're doing employee surveys, so we don't even know who's being harmed the most and which incidents are harming those people at the core. We have lots of data at our disposal. We have resource utilization data. We have annual pulse surveys. We have health assessments even. We even have productivity and absence metrics. Most folks, if we're honest with ourselves, will recognize that that great resignation that we are bearing witness to is also a mental health one, a racial justice one, a indication that we all need to live and lead more mindfully. You also have to be willing to activate and amplify people within your organization to support you. This is village work. We have so much talent within our organization, so much passion and compassion for these issues. So determining how we can leverage and build partnerships both internally and externally to amplify this, to create an ecosystem of mindfulness is actually the way to go. But the other thing to keep in mind is that there will be times perhaps when employees who are moving through these experiences and trying to metabolize them will need supports for higher levels of acuity of symptomatology. And having a continuum of offerings and services is one way that organizations can help both their organization and individuals become more mindful, like the continuum of care that we provide at Headspace, where we offer a unified front door through which individuals can move from mindfulness to get coaching, therapy, support, and psychiatry. All of this can be wrapped up into EAP solutions that also can be leveraged to create more organizational mindfulness. The point here is that all employees will not need, therapy, but everyone in this moment, in this time, in this space we're living will need support. There are also, important data collection factors and features that will help you uncover and become more aware of dynamics in your organization that might be militating against becoming more mindful. Collecting identity-focused data, also looking at intersectional factors so that you're not just looking along rote demographic lines, partnering with your employee resource groups, but incentivizing them also, because sometimes we leverage the support of employee resource groups at their expense. And I think we have to recognize that this spirit work we're talking about, advancing racial justice, requires a kind of mindfulness on their part that's always present. So we have to create space, hold space for them to also take a pause. And us as leaders and organizations take up the heavy lift of doing the work of culture change. But as we grow and learn, as we're also doing at Headspace, we're committed ourselves to becoming a learning organization. Getting to a more mindfully, racially just organization requires us to never get complacent with what we've learned, to always be putting ourselves into the position where we're schooling and retooling in ways that help us to grow our capacity for empathy, for deep listening, for loving kindness, for non-judgmental present awareness. Because in the end, it is a radical act of love and sanity to cultivate mindfulness in these ways. And we can do that through regular embodied practice, but it requires courageous political action in support of the truly equitable justice that we hope to see for all. I want to thank you for listening to the presentation, and I think now we'll take some questions from all of you, and I look forward to what you have to share. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Powell. That was just so powerful, and I can see that a lot of folks in the chat were also incredibly grateful for you to provide us this holistic view. Catherine asked if you'll be able to share these slides. And if yes, we can distribute it to the presenters. But her follow-up question was, how do you get leaders to change?
Yeah, leadership change is really a challenging area. But what I would say is this: there are systematic leadership development courses and trainings that we often provide, over the course of a person's trajectory in an organization. And we forget that the same ways that we teach folks how to balance a spreadsheet, how to do their end of year evaluations, that we can cultivate a similar kind of consciousness in an organization using those same strategies. So slow, deliberate, layered training that's tailored. We are at Headspace developing individualized, tailored learning journeys for our senior leaders and for our employees, with the understanding that the change will take time. People are having to relearn habitus that they have been exposed to and deploying their entire lives. So I think the one thing that we have to do is to be patient, but then have a set of conditional, zero tolerance, policies and practices in place.
That's wonderful. Tara shared holistic mind, body, and spirit are so interconnected. So if I don't see any other questions, but this has been such an incredible session for all of us. And thank you again for sharing your wisdom. I mean, so appropriate that your name is Dr. Wizdom Powell, and really to inspire us in thinking about all of these systems and structures more holistically. And it's really perfectly timed because our next presenter is going to be speaking about how we heal these challenges of racialized trauma that's in our body using various methodologies. So I would welcome everyone here to just applaud Dr. Wizdom Powell for her time and her, her wisdom with us today.
It's been such an honor and a privilege to be here with you all. I am so grateful for this community of radical healers that have come today with the sole intention of disrupting the status quo of bias. And thank you, Anu, for your leadership and pulling together this incredible summit. Happy to partner and collaborate with you on this and on the work ahead. So
yes, indeed, the work ahead, and we're all part of this beloved community together. So thank you, Dr. Powell.